Hi, everyone, and welcome to my first EA Zoom meeting presentation. I'm really glad that everyone could make it today. And I'm beginning this project really by doing a little bit of a self-disclosure. And I'd like, I'm doing this in essence to kind of begin to cultivate hopefully a safe space that we can engage in an ongoing dialogue to discover the nature of astrology and how the archetypal perspective in particular, what I'm schooled in, reflects and correlates and resonates with the evolutionary approach. So what I decided to do was to begin by doing kind of a full biography in a sense of the major turning points in my life that led me directly to the astrological perspective. And I think that the transits that I've recognized that correspond to those major events, I think are rather instructive. So it was a dual aspect of the way I'm approaching this. So it's partly instructive and partly just relational. I'm trying to get and allow people to understand who I am and the way I came to astrology and the way I approach it. So that's the basics of what I want to begin with. I guess I should say I've been studying astrology since October of 1995, which we will look at here. But I've been studying specifically with Richard Tarnas and Stanislav Grof since 2003, and focusing on the archetypal perspective, which is really based in the planets, the planetary alignments, their aspects, and their relationship to psychology. It really evolves out of depth psychology. So I think that's probably a good introduction, and maybe we'll go ahead and dive in at this point. So let's see here. Okay, hopefully, does that look right?
Yes, yes, that's good. Thanks.
Okay, great. So I'd like to begin just by saying, again, I am being rather vulnerable here, discussing a lot of very personal experiences that I've had, and I'm doing that in essence to try and cultivate this safe space. So I want to encourage everyone else to feel safe in expressing their opinions, their perspective, and also kind of to hold space for each other in a sense, because we all know that there's a lot of trolling on internet sites, and a lot of people say things that they wouldn't say to others in person. And so I want to, not be victim to that in essence, and be able to disclose our personal experiences, but to maintain a safe container to do so. So I'd appreciate your help in that as well. So to begin, first, a precautionary statement. I'm not advocating for anyone to do anything illegal. I'm hopeful that the resurgence of legal research will someday make available the legal sanctioned, safe, and therapeutic use of these sacred medicines. Until that day, there are safe and effective alternative methods for accessing the deep unconscious, including various forms of meditation, vision quest experiences, and breathwork practices, which can facilitate deep healing, non-ordinary states of consciousness experiences, which I've also participated in, and I'm very thankful for and championed those methods as well. My early experiences happened to go through psychedelics, but I feel lucky that I was able to navigate those experiences without a lot of guidance, which our culture doesn't really sanction those rites of passages for youth into adulthood very well. So often we seek it on our own. But again, I'm not advocating for anyone to do anything illegal. So this is my natal chart. Oh, I wanted to, sorry, I'm gonna put on a laser pointer real quick. Okay, so yeah, this is my natal chart. I was born at May 5th, 1973, 11:08 p.m. in Tallahassee, Florida. And these are the tight alignments in my chart. I'm born with Pluto near the midheaven in the 9th house at 2 degrees Libra, and it's square to the moon at 0 Cancer. I'm born with the sun at 15 degrees Taurus, and my rising sign is 22 degrees Sagittarius. The tightest aspects in my chart are Uranus trine Saturn, it's within 1 degree, and I also have Mars trine the Moon, and the Moon is in a sextile to Mercury, and Mercury in a sextile to Mars. So those are some of the major alignments. I also have Pluto in a sesquiquadrate to the Sun, so that you can see all those aspects here. So it's a 1.5 degree sesquiquadrate. It's a 1 degree square to the Moon. And then the way I kind of like to look at it is, on my good days, or when I'm like in fully, operative functioning in the zone kind of a place, the wide orbs tend to also come through. And if you look at those, there's, kind of this more of a wide grand trine with Mars, Jupiter, and Uranus, and Saturn. And there's also a Pluto is square to the nodes, which I don't have a lot of specific insight into, and I'm curious to hear what the community has to say about that. But yeah, I guess that's maybe a good general overview. I have Jupiter is also square to the Sun. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. And I have a Mercury Uranus opposition. It's a 10 degree opposition. So that's one thing that the archetypal perspective does, is it uses wider orbs, and we'll get into that closer to the end. But to begin with, my first psychedelic experience was with cannabis. I was 14 years old. A friend of mine on my basketball team introduced it to me and said, "Hey, you want to give this a try?" And I was 14 years old. I had Saturn opposing natal Saturn, which you often see with those, early rites of passages, in a sense where children kind of differentiate from their parents. It happens at 7, at 14, 21, and 28, of course, the Saturn return. But at 14, you often see children, adolescent children, kind of really not wanting to be seen with their parents. They're really striving to differentiate, become their own person. And this is one of the ways in which I did that. You can also see that Uranus was conjoining my ascendant and opposite Saturn as well. So it's kind of a break from the past, a break from traditional structures, and experience of a new experience reflected in the archetype of Uranus. So my first cannabis experience was truly a psychedelic transpersonal state. I smoked a whole joint. I went into what was a convulsive laughter. I could not control the laughter that was taking place, and it was simply due to the feeling I was experiencing. It had nothing to do with what I was witnessing or seeing in my environment. I was in a full state of laughter, to the point where my friend who was there was concerned because my parents were upstairs sleeping, and he came to try and get me to stop laughing. And I literally could not stop. It was an uncontrollable, spontaneous laughter that was coming from the gut. It was coming from an instinctual place of feeling place. And it was deeply transformative as an experience. And I was moved by it immensely. So I smoked marijuana for most of that summer of my 14th year. I began listening to all sorts of music, ended up listening to a good bit of Pink Floyd, which Pink Floyd has a psychedelic background. They had a lot of LSD usage in their early days in England. And I was drawn to the idea of mushrooms. Mushrooms are an organic, naturally occurring psychedelic. They grow in feces of cows at all of the basically subtropical latitudes. So I was raised in Florida, and it happened to be that mushrooms grew in the field. And I decided on my own to go out and get them. I had a unconscious desire to really have this experience, and I did it by myself. It wasn't like friends were asking me, peer pressure or anything like that. I actually had to seek out and find a demand really to ask where the mushroom field was, because I didn't know. And some older students told me, and I ended up going out into the field by myself and picking mushrooms. And I had first, to let people know that maybe aren't as familiar with psychedelics, it turns out that this is serotonin, which is the chemical structure for the neurotransmitter that is largely responsible for consciousness. And LSD was discovered actually in 1938, but then in 43 it was brought into real research. In the 50s, it was given out to psychotherapists around the world. And it turns out that serotonin, I believe, was discovered in 1954 in the brain. And there's a strong relationship to LSD and the usage of it and the recognition of serotonin as a neurotransmitter in the 50s, which ends up leading to all of the SSRIs and our understanding of neurochemistry today, really in large measure developed in the 50s. And LSD was actually part of that understanding, of the development of that understanding. It's washed away in our history today, but that it was a big part of it at the time. And it turns out that this is psilocin, which is the active component, or psilocybin. It's really similar. Psilocybin gets broken down into psilocin immediately upon ingestion, and you can see how closely structured the chemicals are in their molecular structure to each other. And so this is basically why they work. They get into where serotonin normally goes in a receptor, and it tricks your brain, and you have a different experience. We could go into details about that, but I just wanted to kind of convey that there's a real, and many people actually believe that psilocybin in particular may have been partly responsible for the evolution of consciousness in the human species, because we incorporated it into our diet millions and millions of years ago. Different story. We can talk about that later. So my first experience was in the summer of 1989. I don't know the exact date. I know that I was 16, and I just turned 16. And so it was through this summer that I was really experimenting. So I'm only using the outer planets as indicators. And the specific one is Pluto was opposing my sun. And this corresponds, in my perspective, to the kind of unconscious desire or draw to have a deep, profound experience. To push the edges of the envelope, in essence, Pluto, to have a scary, frightening, potentially experience, or experience that I lose my sense of self. And I'd also like to point out that Uranus was in a trine from 3 degrees Capricorn to my natal Mercury at 0 Taurus. And then also there was a Saturn-Neptune conjunction, but Neptune and Saturn both trine to the sun. So you can see Neptune trine the sun in the sense of connecting to the spiritual or to the transcendent, or an easier access for the sun, the solar being, to have access to the Neptunian imagination and vision. So this was my initial experiences, which were profound. I will say this: the very first time I took mushrooms, I had a simple conversation with my mom. It was, I took the mushrooms, I writhed around in my bed uncomfortably for a while, not knowing what was happening, and just in this uncomfortable kind of state. But then I started to feel good, and I went into my mom's room and just started talking to her, and like everything was, cool. And I was definitely having an interesting experience. I was seeing slight visual distortions. And then my mom said, "Hey, Chad, I need to go pick up your sister from the mall." And I said, "I'll do it." And so I volunteered to drive the car to the mall, and she kind of, I think maybe she thought I was stoned or something like that. She didn't advocate any of that, but I think she might have picked up on it. She was like, "Oh, where are you going? Are you sure you want to do that?" And I said, "Mom, you don't understand. This is great." So I went outside. I went out and I was barefoot, and I'm allergic to grass and all animals that lick themselves, so I have lots of allergies. And she was really protective, and she didn't let me go into the grass without clothes or barefoot or anything. And I had the most grounding feeling. I had this feeling of being grounded to the earth in a way that I'd never felt before. In large measure, it felt partly because of being barefoot. And so she's like, "Chad, you need your shoes." And I'm like, "Mom, you don't understand. I don't need my shoes." And I just had to convince her. And anyway, I get in the car and I'm driving down the road. And the reason I have this cloud image is because I'm literally driving down the road. I'm 16 years old. I'm in awe of the clouds. I'm recognizing the depth and the complexity of them in a way that I'd never seen. And then I had this realization that all of life, as we know it, is balanced in the amount of cloud cover on the planet. If there's not enough, rain doesn't happen and life doesn't occur. And if there's too much, it drowns everything out, and it doesn't work either. And so I was in this really high state, my first experience, and I had this profound insight into the nature of life, into the nature of reality. And it really transformed my whole being. I wasn't able to go back to school in the same way that I did prior to that experience. I felt like I was learning things that transcended what I was learning in a rote educational environment. So it began to kind of really shift my perspective. And what happened next was, well, I'll say this. I did mushrooms for about 8 months. I did a lot of them. I felt like I was having really profound experiences, and a lot of them had this type of imagery is the best picture I could find. I had a lot of purple and green paisleys that were, would color the walls or whatever I was looking at, but I had a lot of control in the experience. I could make the walls breathe in on me if I wanted to, or I could kind of shift the patterns with like an intention. So I didn't feel as though the mushrooms were in control in a sense, or like that I still felt as though I had too much egoic power ultimately in the experience. And what happened was I was watching the movie Pink Floyd's The Wall, and this is a scene from it. And like I said, Pink Floyd is associated with LSD. I kind of assumed from watching it that the character Pink was under the influence of LSD in this type of situation. And what happened is in this scene, his girlfriend, who walks into the room as a shadow, becomes this horrific monster, and it scares Pink out of his mind. And I watched the scene, and I literally said to myself, that's what I want. It's like, that's what I want to have happen to me. I wanted the experience to take over. I didn't want to be in control. I wanted to be frightened, in essence. And I was, but not in the way that I was thinking. When I first took LSD, does someone have a question? Okay. So when I first took LSD, I would say, I know I'm Chad, but I don't really know who I am. And then I look to my sister, I say, I know you're Katrina, but I don't really know you. And then my friend Danny, I know you, Danny, but I don't really know who you are. And then I would be like, I'm on Earth, but I don't really know this place. And in retrospect, basically what I feel as though was happening was it was a psychological death and rebirth. And there was a part of my psyche that was dying and a new part that was coming out to see the world for the first time. And I was in this weird in-between state of actually being able to, understand that process a little bit and participate in the new unfolding of self. So I was frightened, but not nearly in the way that I was anticipating of being frightened through some visual imagery. It was much more of a psychological fright of sense of identity, who I was. And fascinatingly, towards the end of the experience, I had what, by all accounts, is a sacred mystical vision. This was the closest image that I could find online that is similar to it. It doesn't do it justice. What I saw were circular crosses. They were purple and green. They were going in and out of each other and down this kaleidoscopic tunnel. But different from this tunnel, there was a white light in between the crosses that was numinous, and it was indescribable white light. It was penetrating and all-encompassing of the kaleidoscope. And this took over my vision for about 2 hours. I was completely entranced in this state. And as the state ended, I came back to my sense of self. I remembered who I was. I remembered where I went to school and all my friends and family. And actually, I was at a party at my house, my parents' house, and I ended up going around and experiencing everyone else's experience because I took it about 3 hours earlier than everyone else. So everyone else is still this really high, and I'm like back down to slight sense of normal, and was able to really experience everyone else's experience. It was a fantastic learning experience, honestly. And then the next morning, let's look at the transits. So this is only 2 years after. I actually have the exact date for this event. It was April 6th, 1990. And what happened was Pluto, again, was opposite the sun. And this is where I really correlate the death rebirth experience, but the impulse to have it, the desire to have the frightening experience, to go deep, to go into the depth of the psyche ultimately. It feels as though Pluto really corresponds to the impulse to do that, but then the transformation that also took place through the experience. And I'd also like to point out that there was a Jupiter-Uranus opposition in the sky at that time, which you actually see with the history of like major scientific breakthroughs and rock and roll, but also the history of psychedelic usage, and it being so when Stan Grof was first given LSD, it was in 1955 during a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. You can see the resurgence that took place in this decade began in the early 2010, 2011 period, which is a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that corresponded to the Arab Spring. So there, you also see with Jupiter-Uranus often is the real exciting wow vision, or the psychedelic imagery. And then I'd also like to point out that Neptune was in a really tight trine to the sun, which makes so 14 degrees Capricorn to 15 degrees Taurus. And that seems to correspond to the ease of immersion into the spiritual or into the transcendent dimension. I'd like to point out that I was 16 years old. I didn't know what ego was. I didn't know what spirituality was. I didn't know what consciousness was. I didn't know what psychology was. I was raised agnostic. So I didn't have like a spiritual upbringing. And I was at this point being disenchanted from school as well. So there was a real disenchantment from popular culture, sports, all these things that people were doing that I wasn't finding the same meaning in that I did prior to taking these substances. So it seemed as though there was a real kind of radical shift in my being and the way I saw myself in relationship to the world and to everyone else. And I was deeply thankful for this, but also, disoriented. And I ended up not finishing high school, just almost out of will. But at the very end, I ended up just getting my GED and just really disenchanted with it, not finding a deep connection or a meaningful outcome from it. And I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. So I didn't go to college. I was like, wait, what am I going to study? I don't really know who I am. I don't really know what I want to do. And so I ended up going on Grateful Dead tour, basically. I saw 27 shows in 3 years from 92 to 95. And it was a safe place. If you aren't familiar with the Grateful Dead, they basically were a psychedelic church that went around the United States, around the world, around the United States, and would gather in groups of 10, 20,000 at a time. And they put on a show that was structured in essence as a safe space or container for the psychedelic experience. They'd play a first set, go off for 45 minutes, and they play the beginning of the second set, which would just be a few songs, but then they would go into drums and space, and it was just rhythm and just non-rhythm music. So the second set would have an evolution to it where it opened up into a transcendent state of music that would mirror your transcendent state of consciousness. And then the last of the set would coalesce and resolve into a few songs that would kind of bring you back home then with the encore. So this was the safest place to go into psychedelic experience if you didn't have another safe container to do so. So this became my container for that practice. And this is actually an image of the second to last show I saw. This is after Jerry Garcia died. This was in Santa Clara. And this rainbow was one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had, because there was no rain that day. There were no clouds in the sky all day. It was sunny until the time of the show, and these clouds came up right at sunset, and this rainbow appeared, over the stadium, and I'll just describe my experience. I was actually behind the stage. I was right here, and I couldn't see it. And I was listening to the music so well that I heard the audience start to go, oh, wow. And it changed the nature of what I was hearing. And so I was like, what's that? And I turned and looked up, and there's this amazing rainbow. So a powerful synchronicity, in my opinion, from the universe, disclosing how special that experience was. And so what happened is after Jerry died in 1995, I moved to Sarasota, Florida, and I had resisted taking MDMA or ecstasy for several years because it is a completely synthetic psychedelic, or empathogen, as it's more called these days. And so I had a real hesitancy to taking it because I liked the organic nature of mushrooms, and LSD is actually semi-synthetic. It's made from ergot, which is a fungus as well. But MDMA is completely synthetic, and it was only due to several good friends suggesting strongly that I would benefit from the experience. And so I decided to take it. And on my second experience, I had a simple conversation about astrology with a woman, Sarah Jane White, who she would just describe aspects of the signs. And I was in such a heightened state of awareness. Oh, yes. Sorry, I should stop just real quick. No, I'll go back. I was in such a heightened state of awareness that the conversation itself, she would just mention something about Aries, and then I instantly understood what Aries meant just by reflecting on my father. And then she would say something about Gemini, and I would understand the nature of Gemini in such clear ways because I knew my mother so well. It went on to other friends that I knew and knew their birthdays. So I'd been looking into astrology. It wasn't something that was completely foreign to me at that time, but I hadn't made the connection. And this conversation, at the end of it, I was literally jaw dropped. I left the conversation with like in a sense of, why didn't I see it before? That was the type of shift that had taken place. And I immediately went to the bookstore the very next day, got everyone's charts I could think of, my own, my friends and family, and started getting books. I ended up buying my first computer to run SolarFire, to be an astrologer ultimately. It wasn't something that I was planning on doing, but it was something that just gripped me and took hold. So what I did actually in researching for this talk, I didn't realize that just 5 days prior to that experience, there was a solar eclipse happened on the 23rd of October, 1995. And it was at 0 degrees Scorpio, 17 minutes, which is just 16 minutes from an exact opposition with my natal Mercury. And then 5 days later, I had this simple conversation about astrology that just broke open my awareness. And what was happening on that day was that Mercury in the sky was exactly conjoining my natal Uranus, and Uranus in the sky was moving into a 3-degree square with natal Mercury. So 2644 Capricorn to 0 Taurus is the beginning of a square from Mercury to Uranus. And I also had Mercury conjunct Uranus. So I was about, probably about 2 years into my study, and I had recognized some of these alignments, and I was really struck by them. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. This kind of makes sense. I wonder what more can be understood from it. I happened to, I should say this, yes. So this is the best image I could come away with or grab from the internet that, provokes or provocatively describes my experience. This is a picture, a portrait of St. Augustine for his conversion experience. And that's ultimately what it felt like. It felt like I had moved from a disenchanted place where I guess I should have mentioned this earlier. Prior to discovery of astrology, I was raised agnostic, but I was seeking meaning. I felt as though there was divinity, that there was way too much organization and intelligence in the universe for it to be random and to be an accident. But I wasn't finding any of the religions to hold enough water for me to find solace in. All the religions to me seem hierarchical, patriarchal. Just there's flaws in all of them, in my opinion. And so I wasn't able to find resolve in any until the astrological perspective happened. And honestly, it felt like this. It felt like a conversion experience. It felt like a divine illumination, an insight that came from the beyond, and it rendered my heart, in essence. I mean, I was much more of an intellectually minded person before I took MDMA, and it shifted not only my intellectual perspective on the meaning of life, but also my heart and the way I oriented towards people. And MDMA has a heart chakra type opening, an empathic, compassionate opening in its experience, very, very often in its experience. And that was certainly mine as well. So this is the word ecstasis, or is where we get our word ecstasy. And it means the state of being beside oneself or wrapped out of oneself. And that is probably the best way to actually describe my experience. It was an ecstatic release from my normal sense of self, and being able to stand out of the side of that and be able to perceive things in essence of the way they actually are. Kind of like William Blake's, like, when the doors of perceptions are cleansed, you will see the world as it really exists. So that was a bit of my first MDMA experience. And I'd like to close that section by just saying I'm not advocating for anyone to do anything illegal. And I hope that the resurgence of legal research will someday make available the legally sanctioned, safe, and therapeutic use of these sacred medicines. Until that day, there are safe and effective alternative methods for assessing the deep unconscious, including various forms of meditation, vision quest experiences, and breathwork practices, which can facilitate deep healing, non-ordinary states of consciousness experiences. So, oh, wow, we're super late already. Okay, so what happened was 2 years later, I attended a lecture by Rick Doblin. He's the head of MAPS. This is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They're actually responsible for the legal research that's taking place today, and very likely will get MDMA legalized as a therapeutic medicine for PTSD in particular within the next 3 years or so. They're also doing a lot of other research in other areas with terminally ill cancer patients and that type of thing. But what I wanted to say is that I approached him after the lecture, and I just asked him the specific question. I said, I'm deeply interested in the connection between psychedelics and astrology. And he said, oh, Stanislav Grof, and I think his name is Richard Tarnas. They do research in that area. And I was like, what? And so I ended up getting Rick's number. This is Richard Tarnas and Stan Grof. And I ended up getting Rick's number off of CIS's website, the California Institute of Integral Studies, where he is a teacher. And I got his number and I called him and I left a message. I said, I'm Chad Harris. This is when I was born. This is what happened to me on this day. These were the transits I had. And does this make sense to you? And Rick, being the amazing, loving, compassionate person that he is, called me back 5 days later and said, yes, actually, it's classic for that awakening to take place with the double Mercury-Uranus and that alignment. But he also pointed out another transit that I had missed, which is really important, which is the fact that Saturn in the sky was at 18 degrees Pisces, which is a 1 degree square to my natal Saturn. And you might remember that Saturn was here opposing my natal Saturn when I first smoked ganja for the first time. So it's the next square, the 7-year alignment since that time. And what he mentioned was that it actually may be something that's important for my career. So I didn't actually take that in fully at the time, but I basically said to him when he resonated or reinforced my perspective that I was onto something that made sense, I basically said, what do I do now? And he said I could come audit classes at CIS and study with him. So I bought a van, drove from Florida, came to San Francisco, couch surfed for the first little while, and ended up befriending Rick, auditing for a while. And then I suggested that I could run the computer in his classes while he taught, and he was open to that. And I ended up, I've been working with him for the last 14 years. So this were the transits that I had when he called back, actually, is a Mercury-Uranus conjunction in the sky on my natal Jupiter. So yeah, it was a breakthrough, a sudden, unexpected good fortune in a sense, and has led me to where I am today. Now, I want to say that I studied astrology from October of 95 up through 2003, largely by myself, incorporating what I could from 2000 from Rick's work. But then when I came back out in 2003, I read Cosmos and Psyche for the first time. And I had held on to a certain level of skepticism, even with the profound experiences that I had and all that I was seeing in my own chart and my friends. I still held on to the possibility that I potentially was projecting what I was seeing. But when I read Cosmos and Psyche, that was extinguished. I realized from reading his book that it's not possible for any single human being to project the evidence that's in Cosmos and Psyche. It's just not possible. And so at that point, when I realized the depth of what was happening and the overarching historiography aspect of it, of like how it's not just me, it's not just individuals, it's all of humanity, that we're all participating in these archetypes. It went way beyond like, okay, is this real? Is this not real? It changed my perspective into how is it happening? It was a shift in orientation to understand how and why, in a sense, versus is it happening? So it was a dramatic shift. And so what I wanted to do here is I was going to go through a little bit of the way the archetypal perspective orients, and then I was going to do just a quick of the little bit that I've read over the past few days of the evolutionary approach and kind of contrast that. But maybe I should ask if there's a question first, or does anyone?
Okay, just give us a moment to think. Okay, perhaps we could get some questions later, Chad. Thank you.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay. This is from an article that Rick wrote for the Mountain Astrologer, and it was suggested for him to write it because there was kind of a debate going on of what archetypal cosmology was. So it comes out of that writing. So he says, the word archetype comes from Platonism, and in the West, the concept of an archetypal cosmos was first articulated by Plato, a philosophical vision of the universe as pervasively ensouled, informed by transcendent archetypal principles, and ordered in its complex celestial movements by a sovereign divine intelligence. The earlier roots of this perspective, the ancient pantheon of Greek myth and gods as archetypes, the ritual illuminations of the mystery religions, cosmos as divine revelation, and the Pythagorean disclosure of a universe whose unitive order was at once mathematical and numinous. For the Platonic Pythagorean tradition, to align with the archetypal order of the cosmos was to realize one's essential being. To know the cosmos was to know thyself. So this basic principle was understood that the cosmos itself was divine, that it had an eternal divinity to it, and that we, in essence, were in this place of change, and we're striving to align ourselves with that perfection. So what's really interesting about the work that Rick and Stan did, and I should mention this, the reason they discovered astrology was because they were working with Stan Grof's non-ordinary states of consciousness research. So he did 15, 20 years of legal LSD research in Czechoslovakia and in Maryland. And what happened at the Johns Hopkins University or Medical Center, and what happened was they were constantly striving for a test, to have some form of psychological test that would give them some type of insight into what type of an experience someone would have when they took LSD, versus 2 weeks later they have a very different experience, or why two people on the same day take it and have very radically different experiences. There was no test within the psychological battery of tests that gave them any indicative insight into what would take place until someone came through and suggested that they look at transit astrology. And they basically did it out of thoroughness. They weren't really expecting it to work, but when they looked at it carefully, they recognized that there were deep, deep connections. And so I'll just go ahead and skip to the end. What it actually seems like is happening in a psychedelic experience is that your ego is not as present, it's dissolved in some way, and you are a more vivid embodiment of the archetypal complexes in your natal chart, and specifically the transits that are taking place at that time. So you have a map and a calendar, in a sense, a timing mechanism for understanding when certain archetypal complexes are going to be more activated, and therefore you can navigate with those potential unfoldings of complexes or energies in your experience with the knowledge that they're happening. So the unusually profound encounters with the deep unconscious that we were studying frequently involved direct experiences of an archetypal dimension of reality, whether in the form of mythic figures and narratives from various cultures, gods and goddesses, transcendent Platonic ideas, or Jungian archetypes. We found that by far the principal factors in understanding these experiences were the major planetary aspects in natal charts, personal transits and progressions, and world transits, meaning where the planets are just in the sky at that time. So the evidence also suggested that the importance of recognizing larger orbs than have generally been used in traditional astrology. We came to see aspects not as acting like isolated on and off light switches, but rather as indicating archetypal waveforms that enter into the individual or collective psychic field and interact with the larger complex whole of archetypal dynamics cumulatively operative in the field. In essence, the research was driven by a synthesis of two traditions that had been evolving rapidly during the 20th century. Depth psychology of Jung, Freud, and William James, developed further by Ronk, Reich, Klein, von Franz, Edinger, and many others, and what we might call a depth astrology, coming from Rudyard, Leo, Carter, Addy, and Ebertine, among others, contributing to the lineage. So in the later 60s and 70s, both of these traditions witnessed in the various ways a transit involving Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto to the natal chart could be embodied in experience, received a fresh creative infusion, on the one hand, with the rise of transpersonal psychology led by Grof and of archetypal psychology led by James Hillman. On the other hand, with a new generation of psychologically informed astrologers led by Robert Hahn, Stephen Arroyo, Liz Green, and Charles Harvey. So I guess in essence what we're saying here is, or I'm saying is that the archetypal astrological perspective really evolves out of Plato, the Platonic vision, but then in Kepler's understanding of the math, but then the Jungian understanding of psychology, and the depth or the transpersonal nature of the psyche that Stanislav Grof recognized in his LSD research. So in essence, I guess we can see that the planets are extensions of the psyche, are reflective of, reflect the interiority of the human psyche, and therefore act as another level of capacity for self-reflection. So the whole idea in depth psychology is to gain more self-critical self-reflection of oneself, and the idea is that the archetypal astrological perspective serves as a mediator between the two, in a sense, and gives us an actual template, a map for understanding how each individual psyche is embedded in the whole, your birth chart and your transits. So I hope that was somewhat clear. This is something that I don't have a lot of insight into, because I did read Jeffrey Wolf Green's book in '95, but I didn't keep going with it. But the little bit that I reread, the first bit of this, where Jeff talks about the evolutionary principles of the soul's evolution, and so he seems to indicate, like, Pluto with the soul. Like he kind of equates the two. And the archetypal perspective it's not as specific. It's more multivalent and multidimensional in its understanding of the way that archetypes express themselves. So I'm so sorry. What happened? Okay. Sorry. So basically, yeah. So it seems like Jeff Green seems to kind of equate Pluto and soul and the evolution of the soul. And I'm not saying that's incorrect or wrong. It's just that we don't assess that level of specificity to it. And then like when I was reading, he also equates the moon to the ego. And we really don't resonate with that as much. It to us, and to my understanding of what I've been educated in the archetypal perspective, is that the moon represents the mother and the child. It's the mother-child dyad. It's like it's the earliest relationship that we have. So it's the relational field. It relates to how we relate, first to the mother, but then to everyone and everything. Is the mother-child relationship is the primary template upon which all other relationships are formed. So there's the moon represents the child, it represents the mother in all of us, and it represents the relational field. And in a sense, less egoic, it's more pre-ego, in a sense of like, Rick has this statement, which I really love. He says that like the moon is who you are before you even really think about who you are. And I think that's true. It's like the sun is more of the ego in the sense of who you're striving to be. Hi, I'm Chad. This is what I do in the world. I'm an astrologer. That's a function of the ego, the self, the identity, the I. You can throw in some Mercury in there as well. But the moon, to me, it represents more of how I feel, how I emotionally am attuned, how I feel as though I belong to an environment or not. It's that intuitive relational dynamic, less of an egoic sense. It definitely has a strong relationship to the past and to childhood experience, but then potentially even to past lives. And in that sense, I think it has a close relationship to the soul. And my perspective on the soul is that the soul is it's that essential part of us that transcends lifetimes. I wouldn't necessarily equate it to one particular planet. I do think that Pluto probably represents more of that soul's evolution than any other planet, but I wouldn't want to solely identify the soul with Pluto. It seems as though the archetypes are just too multivalent, and that there is a lunar dimension in the soul. There's probably even a solar dimension in the soul. We also see the archetypes as being multivalent and multidimensional, and also interpenetrating. So like Saturn, the symmetry of structure has a beauty to it. That's the Venus in Saturn, that type of thing. So there's nowhere in which any archetype is absolutely solace or solitary. They don't have absolute boundaries. They merge with others. So there are strong identifications with them, but they're not completely separate, autonomous identities or personas. And the other thing about archetypes that comes from Rick's work is that the archetypes themselves are evolving. And this is a speculation, but I totally resonate with it. And that like Plato's understanding was that they were eternal and unchanging. And we see them more as literally evolving with us. That in the evolution of life itself, there's a movement towards wholeness. I think this will be the last thing I say, and we can open up for questions. The other part that I was reading in the evolutionary perspective is that there's assumption kind of source and us, and that there's a separation between the two. And the idea would be that you have choices that you're either separating from the source or you're choosing to return to the source. And I think I read that like the basic principle is that you eliminate all the ideas of separation until you only are left with the choice to move back to source. Well, that may be happening. It may be exactly what the nature of reality. It's hard for me to assume that. I'm more along the lines of, how do we know that the source isn't present? How do we know that it's separate? How do we know that it's not here at present moment? How do we know that? So I think it may be the case. I guess the way that the archetypal perspective is rendered by Richard Tarnas seems to orient is that instead of the evolution of returning to source, it's more of recovering the ensouled cosmos. So the idea is that we see the world as disenchanted, as mechanistic, as materialistic, because we're actually not recognizing its sacredness. That in essence, you could turn it around and say we're in heaven, but we don't perceive it as such, and therefore we treat it as samsara, or something that should be overcome or transcended. And I think the general principle from the archetypal perspective is not that. It's to reorient towards a sacred relationship to what is here now, rather than trying to transcend it and move beyond it. Now, a lot of that's my interpretation of what I've learned from the archetypal perspective. So don't quote me specifically on it, but that's my general orientation around it. Let's see. Sorry, I kind of ran long.
Chad, we have about 8 minutes left.
Okay, great.
We can go over to 10 minutes, that's okay. So does anyone have any questions? Please do go ahead. Oh, did you have more to...
I mean, I can. It's just they're more specific.
Oh, yeah, please
unpacking.
do. Yeah, please do go ahead, and we can take the questions later.
Okay. So I just to give a quick interpretation of the moon and Pluto, this is coming from either Cosmos and Psyche or something similar. So Rick says the moon is the emotionally and instinctively responsive personality, the psychosomatic ground of one's being, the early mother-child relationship, the underlying psychological character, the parts of oneself that are more hidden to one's conscious ego, moods and feelings, changeable, fluctuating in character, though also deeply imprinted, enduring emotional patterns. All relationships, the maternal, the parental, familial, the domestic life, the home, community, one's sense of belonging or not, rooted in early childhood experience, the psychosomatic foundation of the self. So that sense of whether or not you feel comfortable in any given situation, that seems to be a lunar intuition, whether you feel as though you belong or not. So the womb, the ground of life, the body and soul, the psychosomatic part of who we are, that which feels, senses, and intuits, the impulse to gestate, to bring forth, receive and reflect, relate and respond, to need and to care, dependence and interdependence, moodiness, dependency, inadequate self-reflective consciousness, differentiation, autonomy, or individuation. So that's in the sense that lunar function that isn't fully activated can stay in the relational space rather than a solar individuation taking place in the lifetime. That's kind of what he's saying there. So the Jungian anima, the Chinese yin, the lunar feminine are the lunar masculine, the great mother goddess, nurturant female and male deities, the child archetype, the relational ancestral matrix of life, Luna, and all lunar deities. So, and Pluto corresponds to the element of power, depth, and intensity, that which compels, empowers, and intensifies whatever it touches, sometimes to overwhelming and catastrophic extremes, concerned with survival, sex, or power, the lower chakras, the primordial instincts, libidinal, aggressive, destructive, regenerative, volcanic, and cathartic, eliminative, transformative, the ever-evolving, the biological processes of birth, sex, and death, the cycle of death and rebirth, breakdown, decay, and fertilization, violent purgatorial discharge of pent-up energies, purifying fire, situations of life and death extremes, power struggles, all that is titanic, potent, and massive, Freud's primordial id, the broiling cauldron of the instincts, Darwin's ever-evolving nature and biological struggle for existence, Nietzsche's Dionysian principle and the will to power, Schopenhauer's blind striving will, the powerful forces of nature emerging from its chthonic depths. One way I like to describe Pluto is like, it's the part of us that is capable of murder if we're being drowned or something. Like if the part of us that has this will to survive, like we would do things that we would not even think were possible or capable of doing if our life is threatened, that type of thing. It's that instinctual will to survive. That's part of the way I look at Pluto. So anyway, that was the basics for the talk today. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Chad. That was so interesting. Perhaps if we stick with the slides, because people, we may need to refer to them. So are there any questions from the audience? Anything at all? Or any experiences you'd like to share?
I had a question. It's probably more of a clarification.
Sure.
As far as the moon, are you saying that this is equated with the actual biological female mother, or whoever is the nurturer in the family in general?
Yes. I would say both. It definitely corresponds to the actual biological mother and whatever that actual relationship is. But then the moon is a function of experience. Let's just say you're adopted at birth. Then the foster parents and siblings will take on the role of the mother, and that will be your orientation. Your orientation will be to them as that nurturing mother-like figure. But that will be crucially important for how you develop your sense of relationality. But at the same time, there will be some effect from not actually having one's actual mother. I mean, I say there will be an effect. Like, you see it often that children who are adopted have some type of desire or knowing that their actual mother isn't their real mother, and there is some distance of sense of self from that genuine sense of mother. What I am really drawn towards in a lot of one of the real amazing benefits of the psychedelic experience is that people who have deep woundings around that early nurturing experience, where they feel as though they don't belong, where they haven't had that nurturing that gives them a certain sense of self-confidence of being, that they can actually have a transcendent experience to the great mother, to the archetype of the mother, which is reflected in the moon, but that every individual is loved by the universe itself. The universe is the great mother, and we're all its children. And what the astrological perspective does is it gives you meaning and purpose and shows you how you belong, how you're embedded in the whole, how your psychosomatic makeup is reflected in the cosmos at the moment of your incarnation. And then it gives you a tool to have a relationship with the creative intelligence, with the great mother in your transits and following your transits, and in relationship to embodying them with more consciousness rather than being unconscious of them. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Any more questions?
Yeah, I have a question real quick, because I've been at work, so I didn't get to see the whole thing, but I'm going to replay it. But I didn't know if you said any asteroid correspondences.
No, I don't. I really stuck with the planets. It's what comes out of the archetypal perspective from Rick Tarnas. I don't look at the asteroids very much. I have looked at them in my natal chart. They do make a lot of sense. And I also resonate a lot with Chiron. But what I've witnessed is that it's hard for me to see Chiron's transit energies. Like, whereas of the other transits, I can have it's easier for me to grok what the meaning is or the actual energy that's happening. With Chiron transits, I'm still a little like, I haven't been able to resonate with it and grok it. In the natal chart, I totally resonate with it. I see it in my own chart, and I see it in lots of other people's. That makes sense as a natal position. I just haven't been able to make the strong correlations to transits yet. So I'm really into Chiron. I haven't looked at the other asteroids in that same depth. And I've looked a little bit. I haven't, again, resonated with transits.
Right. All right. Yeah, appreciate that.
Sure. Thank you, Cameron.
Thanks, Cameron. Yeah, Chad, I just wanted to say that it's interesting because Jeffrey Wolf Green and Richard Tarnas are of the same, age group, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
So they were under the same similar transits when all of this came up for them. And,
yeah, they're like 4 years apart, I think.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Is Richard like older than 72?
No, he's 1950, so he's 68.
Okay, right, great. Yeah, all of these meanings are the same in evolutionary astrology, like everything here about the moon, it's exactly the same for the moon. And with Pluto, we see Pluto as the bottom line, the context by which to read everything else in the chart, but everything is equal. All of these archetypes are equal and they all work together. Yeah, so look, I don't see huge differences. I think Jeff Green was more, putting it into a structure that we could use and work with.
Right.
But basically, I think it's the same stuff. What do you think?
I agree, actually. There's a lot more resonance than there is difference by far.
Exactly, yeah.
Very much so. The one thing that I noticed, or it felt like there's a strong Buddhist philosophy in the structure of it. That was just kind of my intuition with like the different levels or states of functioning and the hierarchical kind of interpretation of that. But the actual principle of evolution and the evolution of one's being and the totality of one's being as the soul, and archetypal astrology definitely sees it very, very similarly. And I resonate with Pluto as being that kind of final arbiter in a sense, but then again, no archetype being more important than another. They're all equally important in a sense for the totality of one's being.
Yeah. Yeah, the way I see it is that Pluto is like the root of a tree, and then comes all the branches and the leaves, and these represent the planets and the asteroids and everything else in the chart. They're all equal, but they work together.
Right.
And it works for me and it works for a lot of us. So, but yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of this. This is incredible. So let's see if there are any more questions or comments.
Yeah, I would say something. I heard Stephen Forrest talk about a conversation he had with Jeffrey Wolf Green, and how Stephen Forrest talks about the soul and he relates it more to the moon. And they ended up pretty much like agreeing that they were meaning the same thing and just like using different linguistics. But everything you were saying pretty much resonated the same, and it just flowed through. So it was just like different labeling, like different words for the same energy I felt.
That makes a lot of sense, Cameron.
Yeah, obviously astrology is going to come, uniquely from each of us. We're going to see it differently to anyone else, but at the same time, it's kind of similar. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Way more similarities than difference.
We would have to look at Richard and Jeff Green's charts and compare them, and that would be very interesting, wouldn't it?
It would. Absolutely.
Yeah, great. So could you please stop share?
Sure.
Now we can go for a few more minutes. If anyone has any other questions or comments, please do go ahead. Okay, well, with these psychedelics, I've always thought that they were kind of unnatural. because you're kind of like tampering with what is, and then I don't know. I find it kind of scary to go there and tamper with my mind and my psyche. Any comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely understand your fear, and my experience, I've met many people who feel as though you do, and I think that that's perfectly fine, or more so. I'm not saying that right. Like, it seems as though there are people who are already sensitive to transcendent states more than others.
Yes.
People who have strong Neptunes, or I've also seen people who have Saturn Neptune, like a strong, a hard aspect from Saturn to Neptune, have a fear about going into the transcendent states, and they are more sensitive to them anyway. So like, I think it's more of a personal choice, and in the sense of, also, it seems some people need more transcendent help to access or to activate one's psyche to connect to the transcendent. And then the one thing that, like, I felt like was really important for me was just they seem to serve as rites of passage, in the sense that in indigenous cultures, they have rites of passage that allow you to move from adolescence into adulthood. And there's a certain, thing that you prove yourself to become a man. These rites are not sanctioned in our culture. Basically, you become a man if you own your own apartment and car, or whatever it is, that, get married and have status in that way. But it's not like a transformational process of leaving behind the early childhood or adolescent state of consciousness and moving into an adulthood state of consciousness. But then the other thing I would say, just to qualify that, is that there's like I mentioned before, the chemical structure and the closeness of serotonin to psilocybin and LSD. There are a significant amount of anthropologists who have been studying mycology, or mycologists who are mushroom specialists, who believe actually that the psilocybin mushroom, because it grew in the dung of the animals that we were hunting for millions of years, that we were following the animals for food, and we're tracking the scat and the footprints, and that it was centuries of eating the mushrooms because we were hungry, and the closeness that it actually is structurally to serotonin, that it was the incorporation of psilocybin into our diets that actually gave us an advantage. Because if you take a small amount, you get visual acuities enhanced, audio acuity, and sexual arousal and hunger. So like survival of the fittest types of senses are actually enhanced. Your fear of death is decreased, so you're more likely to attack a larger animal. And then so there's a lot of anthropologists who believe potentially that that our consciousness actually developed in a symbiotic relationship with psilocybin, and potentially catalyzed our language forming capacities. Because when you take a high dosage of psilocybin, you go into what's called glossalia, and it's speaking in tongue. You just start uttering sound. It comes from a spontaneous, deep place, and so no one understands why. And then there's speculation that it may have actually enhanced our ability for symbolic representation and recognition. So therefore, language. But again, speculation, and no one knows. But personally, I resonate with it just because my early mushroom experiences were so deeply informative and felt so natural and at ease. It didn't feel like a poison or something that I wasn't. It didn't feel like I was taking a drug and having a messed up experience. It was more like an intuitive experience that felt natural. And I'll give you one example. Early on, I went home and did it at lunch while I was at basketball camp, and I went back and played basketball. and I was high. And my friend who went with me, he didn't do the mushrooms. And after the game, he was like, "Wow, Chad, you should do the mushrooms before you play all the time," because I played really well, and it was just an intuitive play. Like my ego wasn't there. I was just acting out of instinct. And before the mushrooms, he was like, "Oh, why do you do mushrooms? You shouldn't do that." He was very pejorative against them. But then after he saw me play, he was like, "Wow," And so I'm just giving you like one, anecdotal example of how my personal experience felt genuinely authentic and organic.
Yeah. We really do have to wind down. Yes, I love what you said about the mushrooms, and that, it is kind of a natural thing that we've always been eating these mushrooms. And I love that. So that really makes me warm to this, warm to it a little bit more and not be so scared about it.
Right.
And also, I just wanted to say that I feel that I naturally reside in the transcendental states.
Exactly.
I've got Neptune on my ascendant, I've got Uranus on the midheaven, and I suppose we would look at the outer planets, right?
Yes, exactly. And how they're connected to the personal planets and that type of thing.
Exactly. I mean, I just feel there all the time. I just feel, what you're talking about. So
yeah,
I don't have
that's
to
wonderful.
Excellent. So would you all please thank Chad Alexander Harris, everyone. We're looking forward to seeing you next time. Can't wait for that. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a real honor.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Chad.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to next time.
Wonderful. Thank you.